Okay. Hi, Elizabeth Webb. Welcome. My name's Lillian. We've emailed, but we haven't ever met in person, or I guess now digitally. So it's nice to meet you and see you
Nice to
uh,
meet you too.
in as close proximity as we can meet now. And thanks for making the time to sit down and chat with me.
Thank you.
Elizabeth has a film called For Paradise, which is part of our current film programming at the Mackenzie Art Gallery called Paradise for All Those Who Did and Did Not Make It Across. And it's available to view on our website. So if you haven't checked that out already, feel free to do that and return to our conversation for more context. But a little bit more information about Elizabeth. You are an artist and filmmaker from Charlottesville, Virginia. And are you currently based there?
During this pandemic situation, that is where I am. Yes.
And your art practice and your film practice are invested in issues regarding race and identity, using the lens of your own family history of migration and racial passing to explore larger systemic issues around race and identity. And so I came to your film a few years ago, and I found it kind of bewitching, and it struck a very personal chord for me in terms of my own research and my own experiences. And so it was such a pleasure to get an opportunity to kind of fit it into a film program, which explores race identity within a kind of global context with relation to kind of like economics, politics, and climate. And now I get to speak to you. So thank you so much for joining me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's my pleasure as well. And it's been great to read some of your work as well and see how it relates.
Thank you. And so I'm happy to dive in. And one of my first questions about the film, you have several family members in the film, and specifically your father's is featured, and you highlight, or you have a conversation with him, and it's quite frank, and it's about the kind of like newly discovered family lineage that you and your brother and your sister hadn't known about in your childhood. And there's a lot of empathy and curiosity in your conversation. And I'm just curious to know more about how you and your father have kind of had those conversations and worked through that discovery, because I think it is, I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Well, it's been a really interesting process for sure. And it's one that continues because it's real life, and it's,
Yeah.
So it definitely continues outside the confines of the film. But it was interesting because I think doing the film actually is what allowed us to have more open and more frank conversations with each other. Because I think that like the project of the film was something that we could sort of unite around, that wasn't, I don't know, it was like we were working on a film, we weren't working on like our lives kind of. And so there was a sort of element of distance that the creation of the film was actually helpful in maintaining for our conversations together. And so I found that actually our conversations that happened on camera were more rich and more sort of vulnerable and open than our conversations that were outside of that, which was interesting, and it's not generally the case, I find. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly, doing the film has opened up these conversations for my immediate family and my extended family as well, which has been really generative. But it was very difficult to have these conversations with my father, and I think, well, with my father especially. And I think that I don't know, I tried to suspend judgment while I was interviewing him or having a conversation with him, really. But it was also like built into the framework of the film. I was interested in creating a conversation between family members who had never before met each other. And so the process of the film was really the process of recording these conversations with my father, and then taking that recording to his cousins, and then showing them that recording and having them respond, and then taking that back to my father and having him respond. And so it was sort of a strange life film experience.
Yeah, there's certainly, I noticed a contrast between like his own interest, where you share the kind of research that he had done before you were born into his family, not having like a lot of material, like archival information about his own kind of African American roots, and then his choice to kind of efface that in terms of after he's had children, and not kind of embedding them within that. And I am curious how you kind of connect those two. And I see, just especially kind of bringing that recording from like of your father's conversation with you, and that kind of honesty that he and that frankness that he had in his reasoning, and bringing that to your cousins and having them see it, like and I think they metabolized it quite well in the film. But I'm curious how you kind of saw that for your father.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can, of course, psychoanalyze him and try to make sense of why I think he thinks the way he does and views things the way he does. And it may or may not be accurate. I think that the way I've come to understand it, we view things differently, certainly. We view family differently as well. I think that because his father was not a part of his life since before he was born, he did have more distance with that side of his family. And when he did eventually meet his father, he didn't feel a sort of sense of familiarity. He felt, I'm meeting this very kind stranger, but he's a stranger. And for me, I feel like I always had a sort of sense of loss, or like that there were relationships that I didn't have that I could have. That was more of like a hole. And I don't know that he feels, I don't know that he views family, extended family, especially in that same way. I mean, we have a very tight, immediate family. And I think, he did have his own process where he didn't really, he grew up as the mixed race kid in a rural Wisconsin town. And when he moved to the city was when he first realized that people didn't know how to place him. Because in growing up, everyone knew everyone's business. It was a tiny town.
Yeah.
And so at first he was very sort of particular about explaining himself and who he was, and his racial background. And then he eventually decided, well, why am I helping people discriminate against me? And so then when he moved, he sort of didn't mention it altogether, which in the film he talks about race from a very sort of abstract position, right? Which is, of course, a privileged position to be able to look at it in the abstract, and to not have it affect your day-to-day interactions and the way you move through the world in the same way. And so it was hard for me to like sort of reconcile that, that privileged position, and also the sense of loss. Like in the film, the moment when I'm showing my cousins that interview with my father, and for me, it's the most painful moment in the film when I say, do you think there was anything lost in that decision to withhold this family history? And he says, not really. And for me, like what we're looking at in that moment, which are these people, my family, is precisely what was lost. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the film several times, and I find that moment like kind of it kind of stabs me in the heart every time. And I can't help but think that your two cousins, their kind of response is kind of incredibly generous in terms of saying, well, he loves you, look at him playing with you and your brother when you were younger. Like, this is a father who loves his children. And so they understand that response within this like sphere of care and love. And that is just like, yeah, how beautiful and how lovely. And I think, like, as you describe your father's choice to kind of just not mention, maybe, or not aid people in discriminating against him when he kind of made that transition to his adult life in a bigger city. And I think there is kind of a flexibility within a mixed race identity, or within a kind of more racially ambiguous identity, where there aren't those clues that people kind of use visually to categorize people, and kind of not telling. And over time across history, there's been kind of like hostility against this in terms of it being sneaky, or kind of like celebration of it in terms of high fashion or something. But I sort of prefer to kind of like remain in a state of like ongoingness, as I kind of described it, where I'm not denying, but I'm not kind of admitting in terms of kind of my position. And not that I think I'm particularly hard to place, but I just always kind of see that logic as kind of placed in contrast to whiteness. So it's like, how close are you to being white, or how far away from being white are you? And so I kind of always resist playing that game. And I'm curious, kind of like from an African American context, if there's a kind of similar experience, or how you've kind of metabolized that as a result of kind of this project, but also like your own kind of like experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, well, it's actually changed for me a lot over time. When I was younger, I had a darker complexion than I do now, and my hair was curlier. And I think that people ask me what I was all the time. I'm sure maybe you can relate to that, which is a strange question also to be posed as a child, because it doesn't really make sense, right? You don't really know always what is being asked of you.
Yeah.
But I got that question a ton, and I never really knew how to answer it. And I remember in second grade, I dressed up as a question mark for Halloween. And so my first conceptual art piece.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it was like I had a tinfoil giant question mark and a cape, and this like sequin fuchsia mask that I wore. And people would say, "What are you?" And I would say question mark. But anyway.
Yeah, I think I was a princess for like 10 years, so.
Very classic and amazing. Yeah, and so I think Yeah, and I mean, as I grew older, I sort of understood more the implications of that question. I remember in like fourth grade, someone in my soccer team asked me if I was Black, and I didn't know what really that meant. I grew up in a very white context, and I told my mom that this person had asked me that, and I remember that she was quite angry. And I don't remember how she responded, except that she was sort of angry. And I asked her about it years later when I was doing this film project, and she said that she was angry because she knew the family of the person who had asked that question, and she knew from other things that that question wasn't from like a
Simple curiosity.
yeah, that there was judgment behind it, and so that was what had angered her. But yeah, I mean, I think as I grew older, um, and I found this out, it also became really interesting, um, trying to figure out like whether or not it was outing my father, say, to claim this identity. And so that was something I grappled with. But now, I mean, it's interesting because I think, as you said, a lot of these questions are based around whiteness and asking your proximity to whiteness. And it's been very interesting to see how people do tend to ask, like, well, what percentage are you? And or like, how Black are you? And it's like, well, how do you, like, I'll say, well, okay, my grandfather lived as a Black man.
Mm-hmm.
And they would say, oh, so a quarter. And it's like, well, I mean, what does that mean? Like, so he was fully Black, or what is that? What do you really mean by that? Because he also had white lineage.
Yeah.
And so this, I don't know, I mean, it's such a complicated thing that people do tend to like to flatten. And I also like to resist the flattening of that,
Yeah.
because I think that there should be more room. Well, I mean, I still acknowledge, of course, that I'm in a privileged position,
Mm-hmm.
in a white passing body, um, which has its own difficulties, of course, but does shield me from a lot of discrimination.
Yeah, there's this sense of being able to kind of like pull, like extract things from somebody, and kind of like you'll get a fully whole person of this kind and a fully whole person of this kind, and that's obviously not the case. That like you are a whole person and you are not kind of like, oh, oh, what you just did there, like, or oh, that like bit of you like can be quantified. And it's this kind of like insistence, yeah, and once again, like an insistence on kind of like a proximity to a kind of like a norm, and that norm
Mm-hmm.
is generally white. And to bring it a bit back to the film, your brother refers to a kind of hesitancy in his own experience for not wanting to kind of like claim a Black identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there's like an uncertainty for him in terms of feeling like ownership over this. And I'm always curious, and I guess like you can't speak for your brother specifically, but more for yourself, like who gives permission, or who do you think gives permission in those moments? Because I think I know my answer to that question, but I'm curious to kind of put it out in the world. Where does that hesitancy come from? Does it, because I think there are many answers to this question, but I'm curious to hear your take on it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's really complicated, and I struggled with that and continue to some extent. Um, but I think that for me, I mean, I have one of my mentors is the filmmaker Kevin Jerome Everson, and he was my teacher in undergraduate school. And so while I was figuring out a lot of these things, and he was like, well, this is the Black experience. There are so many Black experiences, and it's not one thing. And it sounds like such a simple thing, like it's such a simple answer, but it did sort of open my eyes to recontextualizing it for myself. And I think when people think about Blackness often, and again, this comes back to the question of how Black are you, or what percent are you, and whether or not, like, if you're allowed, if you can pass as white, then perhaps you're not, and your body isn't subject to the same amounts of discrimination as other bodies might be, then many people might say, well, that's not the Black experience, that's not what Blackness is. But then for me, it's also very problematic to think about Blackness only in relation to discrimination, right? Like, is that's the ticket? That's what Blackness is. And I feel like that becomes like a very problematic construction of what Blackness is, which I think it's much more expansive than that. I think it includes more possibility and positivity and beauty than that. And so I think that also is a flattening of personhood in a way, to perceive it in that way.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of beauty, I wanted to bring up your great grandmother because obviously she was the kind of impetus for the film, and a hugely fascinating part of the film that there are no photographs. There's no photographic evidence of her beauty, except the way I guess that it would emanate through her family. And I'm curious, you sent me an interview with Sadia Hartman and Patricia Saunders, and talking about the kind of missing body of the slave and landscape as a witness, and the trouble with having the archive be the home of Black subjectivity. But in the case of your great grandmother, her subjectivity is not found in the archive. She doesn't have there aren't those kind of material traces of her. And I'm curious kind of where you see her subjectivity coming to rest. And how fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some of your writing, I think also, I don't necessarily think of a subjectivity as ever coming to rest. I think of it as more of this ever-evolving thing, right? Like if we think about Stuart Hall and his writing based on Paul Gilroy of the identity as this continual process of coming to be, where as a process of many routes, ROUTES versus roots, a static origin. So I think even though she has passed away, I think of her subjectivity as not resting, perhaps, and not necessarily in an unsettled way, but in a generative way. And I think that for the story of Paradise, I mean, the person who told me that was her youngest daughter, Jane, who's the woman in white, towards the beginning of the film, and who's sort of talking about all of her different siblings and their skin tones in relation to her own. And I was just really struck by her portrayal of her mom in this way. She just said, well, she didn't take any pictures. There are no pictures of her. Mm-hmm. And I would say, well, why? And then she would just say, well, she didn't let her picture be taken. And she actually, there's sort of another layer of the film in that Jane never really met her mother, because Paradise actually died in childbirth with Jane, or shortly after her birth. And so she always had this craving to find an image of her mother, and would ask her siblings, like, well, what did she look like? And it would always be sort of in proximity to another person's appearance who maybe had her eyes or something. And so she was also sort of going through that process in her own life and trying to find her own proximity to this person that she had never before seen or couldn't remember seeing. And I think that at first I was sort of partly because of Jane's desires, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to find a picture of her. And then when I was really thinking about it more, the wording of what she told me, that she never let her picture be taken, I started thinking about Paradise's act as an act of refusal, and how there might be power in that act. And for me in the film, I mean, through Patricia Saunders and Saidiya Hartman's interview, I really started to think about landscape as a witness and what that means, and to search for someone in the land or the place that they may have walked, and to think about like what the trees remember. And the trees are like, many of the trees were there when she was alive, or and to look for her house, like what does it mean to find this place of her house, and that sort of process. And I think that I mean, Paradise, I think what I ended up settling on, in the beginning of the film, has 16 millimeter footage of kudzu, and the end of the film that looks more experimental, after I enter her home, or what was her home, that's actually the same footage as the footage that appears in the very beginning of the kudzu, but after I buried it in the soil. So what happens when you do that is the microbes eat away at the emulsion of the film, and you're left with this sort of partial image, or this broken image. And I projected that image of the film onto my body. And so the sort of thing that you see moving in and out is actually a body, my body, that has the film image, the partial film image projected onto it. And then I was thinking about how perhaps where the image is most destroyed is where you can most clearly see the body. And I was thinking about that in relation to Paradise.
Wow, that's beautiful. I was very, very intrigued by the kudzu as a metaphor, especially in relation to this question of landscape as a witness, because as the kind of narrative voice describes, it's kind of like a colonizing a plant that takes over the entire kind of space that it begins to grow in and inhabit, and it chokes out the rest of the life that's there. And I thought about that in relationship to kind of what Saidiya talks about in this interview about, what burdens are we placing on the dead in asking them to be explained, or to give us any answers, and should we just let them rest? And I see this kind of appearing in your film, and the film isn't about finding a picture of your great grandmother, or kind of like, nailing down anything. It's about rather dealing with the inheritance of, I think what's described in that text as a psychic inheritance of some kind, and how, and I guess you reflect that through your body, and through the kind of like connections that you're building between yourself and those family members that you hadn't met before, as well as your dad and your siblings. And I'm curious, because now it's been, I guess, 4 years since the film was originally made. And one of your cousins who was in the film, I was sorry to hear, passed away a year ago, 2 years ago now.
Would have been, I think, 2015, actually.
2015.
Okay, well, actually, so two of them have passed away.
Okay.
So yeah, one of them passed away about a year ago, and the other in 2015.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I was curious about this because now the film is kind of a site and an archive in a way that initially it hadn't been. And it's changed over time because that person is no longer here, but they are kind of like held within the film. And I'm curious how you've seen how you see the film evolving in that way, and just maybe how your relationship to the film has evolved since it has been several years of kind of it being shown.
Yeah. Wow, I feel like there are tons of questions in there. You want me to talk about kudzu too, or no?
Oh my gosh! Oh yeah. Yes, please.
So kudzu, I think that for me, it sort of was a multivalent metaphor during the process. It really was a shifting metaphor, and it, yeah, it was constantly changing what it meant throughout the process of making the film. But as it ended in the film, I feel like it becomes, I think it still can hold multiple sort of meanings, but I began to think of it as this metaphor for whiteness and this thing that that cannot survive without the destruction of other things, that it has to, that's how it survives, and what that means. And yeah, I think also, I mean, when I was growing up, I would see kudzu on the side of the road a lot, in Virginia, and it's, I always thought it was really beautiful. It's known as like a nuisance or as something that again takes over, but I thought it was this beautiful thing, and always was intrigued by it. But then as I learned more about its history, it has this much darker connotation, and a much darker history. And so I thought about, yeah, I thought about it in relation to whiteness, also in relation to secrets, and what that can do, like maybe a lie or a secret that seems like a good thing on the outside, but then actually is destroying as it progresses. And regarding my family, yeah, it was interesting. I actually, so the one who the film is dedicated to, who passed away during the creation of the film, is Jane, and she's Paradise's youngest child, the woman in white. And I was actually in the editing room, in front of the computer and editing her part of the film when I got the call that she had died. And so it was this very strange and intimate moment that I had, where like her face was like on the screen, and I was like listening to her voice over and over again, because you do that when you're editing. It's like constant and repetitive, and then I got this call that she had passed away, and it was actually one of the other cousins who called and told me that. And so that was a very moving and difficult experience too. I mean, especially because she, out of everyone, was probably the most excited about the film. She was, yeah, she was a little bit of a star, that one. And so she was very pleased to be on camera, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it was, yeah, it was definitely sad to not be able to show the finished product to her. But it is really beautiful to have her face and her voice on screen, and also to have this underlying narrative that isn't talked about as much. But like when I arrive at the end, when we arrive at Paradise's house, the voice that we hear speaking is Jane, and she's talking about when she went back to Alabama for the first time to see her family, because she actually grew up in Washington, D.C., because after her mother died, the children were sort of dispersed and sent to live with their elder siblings and such. And so it's her homecoming as well, that part of the film. And she's talking about seeing her brother for the first time, and he looks at her and says, "Jesus Christ, you're my baby sister." And so that layer of recognition of family is happening alongside the other layers of recognition and perception that are happening when people are talking about generally like my eyes and what how they see my features in relation to the family, etc. Yeah, and then in terms of Annie, Lois, and Betty, who are the cousins, Annie Lois is the one that passed away relatively recently, and she's a Spitfire. She's the one that talked about having shot at her husband, and yeah, I mean, it was beautiful. At her funeral, actually, I was able to connect with some other family members that I hadn't met before, and some of them asked to see the film because they hadn't necessarily spent that much time with her recently, and so for them it was sort of a nice experience to be able to see her on film. And
yeah. That's so beautiful. It's so interesting, the Black relationship to funerals, and how they are kind of like a very frequent family occurrence, and the connections that are built because of them, or as a result of them, I should say. On a more practical note, I'm kind of curious. I know in the film you note that your father had done some research early on and about his family, but in terms of your own work to connect with these family members, were they people that you kind of had connections with already, or did you find them as a result of the film? Like, I'm very curious about that.
Both, yeah. So for Jane, my father did have contact with Jane, partly because he had lived in DC for a bit, and so he was able to connect with her there. And so I think we maybe saw her a couple times when I was growing up. But Annie, Lois, and Betty, the ones who live in Alabama, I found them through a process of research. And what happened was I looked, starting with my dad's archive or of information that he had. I started doing genealogical research and looking up different sites in Eastern Alabama, and found a family church, the church that many of my family members are buried at. And so I went to Alabama and I went to church. And I showed up at church, and during the part that the visitors were supposed to announce themselves, there was actually another man there doing genealogical research for like a different family. And I was there, and I just said who I was and that I was looking for my family. And everyone, people were like, "Yeah, we know who you are." Not directly, but of course, like, "Oh yeah, we know the Webbs." Like, "Oh yeah," because half of them in there were Webbs. And just in different sort of, it was a big family, and so like different levels of relation, but many of the elders, I was really grateful that they stayed after the service and sat with me, and were trying to figure out who my closest relations were. And so we figured it out, and they had their phone numbers. And so I called, Annie Lois is the one I called. And then she invited me over to her home, and we met there.
Wow.
Yeah. I know, I never tell that story. No one ever asks.
That is amazing. Like, how brave also to just stand
Right?
up in church.
That is not like me. I'm a rather timid soul, and so I kind of, looking back, can't believe that I did that. But
Yeah. Well, there's incredible payoff for it.
yeah, no, absolutely. I think I was sort of on this mission that I wasn't even necessarily thinking logically about, but I was just sort of driven to.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's been several years now since the film was kind of originally premiered. In terms of your research and the work that you're doing now, are there kind of continuing threads, or have you kind of moved in an entirely different direction?
There's, I think, always will be continuing threads. I feel like my artistic practice is more like a spiral, or like an ongoing little spiral that always comes back, to what happened before. I think maybe it's just the way I think about things, and I feel like, yeah, everything's always connected to the past. And even in terms of, even if I don't realize how things might be connected while I'm working on them, then like if I look back later, I'm like, oh, well, that was definitely about this thing too. And so I do find that things are connected. And I did, after the film, sort of take a step away from that subject matter, directly, just because I think that although not too far, so looking back, not too far, but because it was like a really intense experience. It was a sort of a 3-year process of making that film, and again, it was like um, a life experience as well. And so I think I did need sort of a break or space from it to be able to look at it, and really see what was going on there. But now I'm interested. I mean, there are a couple projects I'm working on now, mostly in the research phase, especially now during our time of social isolation. But thinking about the landscape of Eastern Alabama and going back to that, I have the field notes, from the original plantation land of that my family owned and worked on, and so which sort of place plants and different plant life and trees at different geographic coordinates, and as a way to value the land. And thinking in surveying language, a bearing tree is a witness to a survey corner. And so thinking about the landscape as a witness more directly, and in terms of surveying land, and how nature can thwart the sort of human imposed grid, and yeah, thinking through those types of things.
Beautiful. That sounds really fascinating. I'm kind of I've always been kind of like ambiently interested in kind of like the aesthetics, how aesthetics are used to kind of create value, and vice versa, how kind of like land value is related to aesthetics, and usually related to like 19th century English landscape painting. But I think it can also relate to like your kind of reference to more like plantations in America. But that sounds really fascinating, and I'm excited to see the kind of outcome of your inquiries. But I'd like to thank you so much for taking some time to sit down and chat, and hopefully provide our audience with a little bit more context for the films and the program in its entirety, which is up online on the Mackenzie website until the end of May. So there's plenty of time to engage with the entire program, and especially for Paradise. So Elizabeth, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Before you stop recording, in case they want to edit something in, I remembered you asked something that I didn't answer. So I will, do you want me to answer it now?
I would love it. If only just to know your answer.
I need to. But yeah, I remember talking about how when we first see my cousin's responses to my father's comment about loss. And I think that for me, I was actually in the process of making the film, I was expecting a different response from them. And as you said, it was a very generous response. And it was one that I didn't expect. And not the one I was looking for, actually. I think that at the time I was really looking for validation of the way that I felt, which was like a little bit, well, how could you have made this decision, all of these things. And I was I was looking for validation in their response. And that's not what I got, really. I mean, there are, of course, many coded layers in the way they respond to that comment. But their response really forced me to take a look at my own thoughts and feelings about that decision, and really helped me to reframe that. And that actually, it's interesting because when I was during the process of editing the film, I found that the people who were most sort of critical of my father's decision were white liberal people in general. And so that sort of goes back to this, an earlier question you asked about finding out someone's ancestry and this desire to not be tricked or to be able to place someone in a box. And yeah, I don't know. I thought that that was, well, not super surprising to me, but sort of surprising. And yeah, so I thought that was an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think your use of the word coded is sort of kind of perfectly placed in terms of, just the understanding, the kind of deep understanding of where that decision might have come from.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and I think it's an understanding that comes from experience and something that maybe a kind of like well-meaning liberal white person might not kind of innately understand just through their politics.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, there's also this, I've been in conversations with people when I tell them about my ancestry, and they'll say, well, like, I'm more tan than you, or like my hair is curlier than yours.
Yeah. Does everyone do this to you? They hold up their wrist to your wrist.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Yeah. And so I don't know. I think that those are all sort of connected things that are rooted in also these deep-seated, suspicions, really, I think, that are encoded into the way people are, well, conditioned, I suppose.
Yeah. I just had the thought jump into my head of like the kind of choreography of a mixed race experience through kind of like this, and the kind of like there's kind of familiar actions, and probably you could probably put a script to it too.
Totally. You totally could. That should be a project.
Yeah. Let's talk. All right. Well, thanks for that. I know I feel like we could do this conversation all over again very easily and quickly.
Yeah.